Could everyone please find their seats?
No. Quarter after.
That's fine. Yeah, I have a 2 o'clock flight.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on now. The second panel discussion that will follow the same process on is on the assessment of embedded software. The legislature enacted statutory provisions in 1972 which provided that all computer software except basic operational programs is exempt from property tax. To assist the implementation of that legislation, the board created Property Rule 152. Then in 2008, the Court of Appeals, the Cardinal Health versus County of Orange, opined that non-basic operational software that was bundled or embedded inside a computer when it's delivered to the customer is not taxable. Obviously, there's ongoing discussions on this issue. We have a group of people who are going to now help us with this. The first panelist is Peter Michaels, attorney at law. Peter Michaels Law. Peter is primarily responsible for big business and exempt organizations in California state and local tax matters. He has represented many industries, including telephone companies, cable, television systems, internet providers, and so on. He has also worked closely with local boards and supervisors, county, city councils, assessors, and county managers on property tax matters. Peter, please go ahead and begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I was asked to address embedded software and how the valuation, the segregation of value attributable to embedded software affects state assessees. That's mostly public utility companies, and as you all know, those state assessees are annually assessed by this Board of Equalization and are not subject to the limitations of Prop 13. So we take an annual look at this issue now, of course. I wanted briefly just to identify the industries that are subject to state assessment and then briefly give you a feeling for how embedded software, how important, relatively speaking, embedded software is to these categories of state assessment, state assessees. They're local phone companies, the former incumbent local phone companies that are state assessed. They're inter-exchange phone companies. They used to be long-distance phone companies. They're assessed by the board. Wireless companies, telephone companies are assessed by the board. Gas and electric utilities are assessed by the board. Inter-county pipeline companies and railroads. And embedded software, to a greater or lesser extent, has is a huge driver in the operation of each of those categories of industry. Now, the concept of a public utility in the first place is a 20th century concept. We don't have public utilities as we did in the 20th century. And the three first categories I identified: local telephone, inter-exchange telephone, wireless telephone. We don't have telephones anymore. And I usually get corrected when I use the word telephone because we live in an era of telecommunications. So whereas the model we're working with used to apply to monopolies, it's now deregulated, it's now competitive, and a lot of the horsepower, brain power of the industries, again, to a greater or lesser extent, lies in the embedded software. I want to mention that we work with the State Assessed Properties Division very closely, especially for the larger utilities and state assessees, and they are receptive. I think they're reasonable. We've had lots of conversations, obviously, both on assessment issues per se and valuation issues. But I think there's an advantage that state assessees have on the valuation side because the State Assessed Properties Division is very knowledgeable and relatively speaking, quite sophisticated on some of these complex property valuation issues. So we are happy to have a receptive staff. Briefly, and I tried to look at this from a perspective of replacement cost new. Relatively speaking, how much of a percentage is embedded software to the overall replacement cost new or the overall value of some of these utility industries just to get a feel. And in some industries, it's not, I don't know the answer, or I didn't do it, I couldn't do it, but in others I did get information that gives us a feel for where we are or where we're headed. Again, just briefly, to revisit local exchange and the former incumbent phone companies, the Ma Bells, they used to require central offices. Those central offices used to be 15,000, 25,000 square feet. That functionality can now be provided with a desktop. They don't need 15 or 30. In fact, they've got all this super adequate space. But that's a separate matter. It shows you how much of the value, how much of a shift there has been in our economy, in the way we do business. And, of course, the local phone company used to be land-based and terrestrial. Now that's your video company, that's your internet service provider. You get data. It's almost as if voice is an afterthought at this point. And the same is true for long distance. Those are internet transport companies now. You don't make long-distance phone calls. And so they are transporting data, especially former long-distance phone companies, embedded software. It's driving what they're transporting, and voice and video too. And it's obvious that wireless is largely driven by application software, and it's wireless is taking over, and we can see with our own eyes because they're actually discrete applications. Moving to the lesser technological industries that are assessed by the state, gas and electric. Well, the smart meter is here to stay, that's for sure. And the the big utilities here in the state that provide electric service already have smart meters, and they're, unlike some of the other industries, and this is, I think, an important point in this conversation, the ability to isolate or segregate value for the embedded software, therein lies the rub. It's pretty tough to do on the telecom side. It's a lot easier for a smart meter, and in fact, the gas and electric utilities have made a specific objective or a point of isolating value attributable to embedded software in smart meters. So we're actually going to be able to, I think, see some good record keeping and some good data that will enable us to make what's otherwise a fairly difficult, sometimes
I'm
impossible.
going to hate to be the bad guy here, but if you could wrap
Oh, really?
up
My 3 minutes is up?
No, you've gone 5, so it's...
Pipelines, inter-county pipelines are now basically run by what's called control and data software. That amounts to about 10% of their RCN nowadays. Probably about 10% of what they're spending is on embedded software. And railroads, there are now emerging green railroads. The railroads are probably at somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of their RCN, their replacement cost, their value is tied to embedded software.
Okay. Thank you. Next speaker is Tom Parker, Colusa County Council. Tom was appointed to Colusa County Council in 2010. He has worked in county government since 1991, including El Dorado, Sacramento, and Colusa counties. Tom has handled county assessor, county auditor and controller, and county tax collector issues since 1994. He is past chair of the statewide Association of County Councils, State Taxation Committee, and chair of County Councils Association, Property Tax, and the Study Group. He is currently a member of the governing board of the County Councils Association. Tom.
Thank you, Senator. I want to very quickly thank the members of the board for allowing me to participate in this and for having this discussion. I've been involved with the state board since 1998 on various things, and it's always been a great pleasure to appear before and discuss items with the board. I don't disagree at all with the importance of the embedded software. In fact, I fully endorse the importance that Mr. Peter here has stressed in his presentation. What I would say, since I deal with the local assessment side as opposed to the state assessment side, the impact of what is and is not embedded software and how it gets valued has a greater proportional impact, in my view, at the local level than at the state level. I say that because your typical state assessee is in the multi-millions or in the billions of dollars in terms of total assessment on their statewide property. And that's how the state board does their assessment business, the statewide unitary model. Local is obviously very different. It's what's only in that county. So the embedded software becomes a real bigger problem and issue. The current statutes, 995, 995.2 of the Revenue and Taxation Code, are, I'll state the obvious, but it's worth saying in my view, horribly antiquated, out of dated, and essentially useless, in my opinion as a lawyer, in figuring out how to assess software, whether it's the so-called BIOS, the basic operational system, or the non-BIOS software system. As a legal matter, having been assessor's counsel for a number of years, when you're representing your assessor in an appeal matter with a taxpayer who is selling or leasing equipment with highly sophisticated computer programming, it becomes a real headache to try and figure out what's going on and what is and is not accessible, let alone get to the value. It's been my experience that the assessee either wants a flat assumed number, X percent, 30, 40% of the value of the machine is the proposal to say that that is the value of the allegedly non-accessible I'll use the term software for purposes of this discussion. But often we get very little informational basis, and if we get any at all, we get it very late in the process. The constitutional duty of the assessor is to do the best possible assessment job and verify and get the number as correct as possible. It is very tough to do in this climate with these statutes, and it's my personal view, and everything I say here is my personal view. It does not reflect the CAA or any particular assessor or the county I currently work for. Rule 152 further complicates the process. It does not clarify and aid the process. The embedded software legal struggles that we have are over quality of pricing and value data and the quantity of data that we get. And if you don't have enough data, and if it's not good data, assessors have a hell of a tough time coming up with a value that they can defend. What I will lastly talk about is what I'm going to label where do we go from here. And this is where I especially stress these are my personal views. They do not reflect anybody I work for or have ever worked for in my career. So if you don't like what I say, talk to me. I believe, having worked with this board on various things since 1998, the state board can play a very important role, not only in terms of its implementation of rules and regulations, and interpretations, LTAs, and the like, but they could also propose clarifying legislation that really cuts through this Gordian knot of this horribly antiquated legislation and comes up with a proposal. And I believe, not noting as well the old admonition, be careful what you ask for, you may get it, I would encourage the state board through the consensus type of process that it employs in these processes to provide some real positive legislative fix, not just a tweak. A tweak is better than nothing. A tweak like AB 832 that I was privileged to be a part of in the process that helped put it together is a nice step so far as it goes, but it doesn't address the fundamental problems. We need to totally overhaul those old statutes. And given the spirit of Article 13, Section 1 of the Constitution, and the fact that the programming industry in this state is no longer an infant industry that needs specialized tax policy protection, it is a full-blown middle-aged adult that can very well deal with its issues. I believe if I were king, and I know I'm not, but if I were king, I would urge the legislature to make all programming taxable, and let's let the assessors get down to the value of what is the value of the property, which is what the Constitution requires. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. The next speaker is Joe Vinatieri. Joe is an attorney at law. Joe is a former mayor and currently serves as a member of the Whittier City Council. He practices primarily in matters of California state and local taxation, including sales and use tax, franchise income tax, and property tax. Joe is former deputy to Ernest Dronenberg, retired board member, and Ernie's out here now as one of the assessors, and is currently a member of the Institute of Professionals in Taxation. Joe.
Thank you, Senator Ritter. And I was warned to keep my remarks, so I didn't do what I normally do. I wrote them down this time, so I'm going to go through it that way.
But did you time them?
I did time them.
Okay, good.
I did time them.
Go
and
for
I've just lost 30 seconds. Okay.
But you're not going to get back.
I was warned. Several of us have been around the State Board of Equalization software awards for quite some time, whether it be within the context of sales tax, and such as the old Intel decision, which morphed into the TTA legislation, we recall, or the property tax and the valuation of computer equipment, the Hahn case, the Master Airline Settlement Agreement, and now Cardinal Health. So it's clear that California, which is home of some of the greatest software minds in the world, continues to wrestle with taxation and software. And I want to share a little bit of my personal experience. Peter's talking about the state level. I want to talk about the locally assessed properties. Our firm represents various aerospace, high-tech defense contractors, research labs, as well as other like-kind companies. With the published Cardinal Court of Appeal decision, I was asked, well, how can I benefit from this case? How do we prove up the value of this application software? Well, I asked the same question of various assessor personnel in a couple different counties, and was responded to by somewhat of a puzzled, quizzical look, and then, well, show us what you got, and we'll let you know, which is always, that's assessor speak for, well, we're not quite sure. So in talking with our counsel, other counsel, and over a period of time, it became clear to me that from county to county, there was no consensus as to what type of data, what kind of information could be provided that would be successful in proving up the value of the application software in that bundled product. So this uncertainty, what it does, it makes it difficult and frustrating for taxpayers to learn how to prepare and to prove up that value, obviously, and by no means is this frustration only on the part of taxpayers, as I've heard it from assessor personnel also. In an attempt to objectify the software valuation issue, and using the aerospace industry as an example, we found that there are generally two types of situations where non-assessable software is found. The first, for example, is where a company performs a multi-million-dollar R&D project that's a self-constructed asset. And most of these projects have a tremendous amount of software development, researching, debugging. In point of fact, sometimes that application software can constitute 50 to 60% or even more of that self-constructed asset. Because engineering labor and similar costs are captured for asset tracking purposes, that software engineering cost is usually ascertainable. But the more difficult situation, as has been alluded to, is where a company procures test and measurement equipment, such as a spectrum analyzer or an oscilloscope. The contractor procures that equipment generally at a lump sum price with no split out of cost for the tangible elements versus the application software elements. And what vendor would typically provide that information, as it would enable competitors to determine manufacturing costs and profit margins, proprietary information which is known only to that manufacturer. So as a practical matter, it is rare to receive an invoice that has this information separately stated. When we lean very heavily on that vendor for quantity discounts, and then we ask them for information on the breakout of the software, well, we find that to be pretty difficult. So, however, we have been able to procure some data, information in the context of add-on application software that was purchased separate and apart from the actual device. This information, I believe, can be very helpful, as it tends to give some type of idea as to the cost of that application software, which may then be attributed to that bundled price. Because of the frustration and lack of clarity, I want to suggest that an appropriate way to handle this situation would be for the State Board of Equalization to invoke its rulemaking authority to amend Rule 152. Now, I know others have proposed, and I would reiterate, that for purposes of statewide uniformity and equalization, the board categorized machinery equipment, M&E, into 8 or 10 categories, such as the medical equipment in Cardinal, or telecom equipment, as Peter was talking about, high-tech test and measurement equipment, whatever those categories might be. And in each category, it would be rebuttably presumed that a certain percentage of the cost of that equipment would be attributable to application software and therefore not subject to taxation. the board could convene an interested parties process and ask taxpayers from the various industries as well as the vendors who supply equipment to those industries who have an interest in helping out to provide studies, data, information to assist the board in conjunction with the California Assessors Association and industry groups to find reasonable and appropriate application software percentages for equipment in those categories. Now, this isn't a new process for the board in its leadership, as it's been done before in the promulgation of the computer tables, biotech, age 581. We're all familiar with all of them. But with the setting of the presumption for the various categories of equipment, this would act as a baseline for both assessors and taxpayers. And if a taxpayer thought the application software percentage was too low, it'd be incumbent upon the taxpayer to provide independent evidence to show that the number was too low. And likewise, the assessor would have the same opportunity if the assessor believed it was too high. Now, I understand some might say it's impossible or just too difficult to come up with the data to determine these percentages. And by no means is this solution perfect, but at least the idea of a rebuttable presumption can bring some clarity and uniformity to this difficult and very time-consuming process for all of us. And I think we're all in agreement, whether you be the state or you're the assessor or you're a taxpayer, that ease of administration and predictability, and I heard that earlier today, predictability is a goal that we should all seek to attain. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Joe. Our last speaker on this topic is Larry Stone, Santa Clara County Assessor. As County Assessor, Larry has overseen the improvements to streamline the operations of his office, eliminating backlogs and achieving higher levels of public service. Larry has been a financial manager on Wall Street and was founder of 2 successful Bay Area real estate investment and development firms. He also served 16 years as a council member and mayor of Sunnyvale. Larry.
Thank you. I, too, want to thank the board for this opportunity. You know, embedded software is certainly a significant issue. Probably the most significant issue that I have faced in the 16 and a half years I've been the assessor. If you take it to its extreme, it's estimated there may be $1 billion of property tax revenue at risk with this issue, and certainly in Santa Clara County it's a big issue to us. We're the 6th largest county in population in the state. We have the 4th largest assessment roll, but we're number 2 in business personal property value. The legislature exempted application software in 1972, supposedly, I guess, to kick off or kickstart a new industry. It was easy back then. Basic operational software that was necessary to operate equipment was accessible, and application software, the time you purchase at Fry's and download into your computer, was not accessible. Well, it's a different world today. Operational and application software is bundled, embedded, if you will, into sophisticated high-tech equipment. The rule generally is understood to be if you cannot operate the equipment, or you would not operate the equipment without the software, then it's accessible. As in any property, real or business personal property, the assessors need evidence, documentation supporting the taxpayer's opinion of value and the exemption. It's kind of a trust and verify standard. I love quoting Ronald Reagan. AB 832, sponsored by assessors, wanted, quote, a clear and convincing evidence standard. What is embedded, and that's the same standard that the assessors face when in Rule 21, where assessors are subject to clear and convincing standard for cable television systems, for example. The current standard, preponderance of evidence, is analogous, in my opinion, to a drive-by appraisal of a shopping center or an office building. We just can't do that. We need the rent rolls, we need vacancies, we need square footage to determine an accurate and correct value. Industry seems to want ambiguity. Assessors need certainty. The law doesn't allow assessors to accept undocumented word from the taxpayers or to apply arbitrary percentages to embedded software. And arbitrary percentages would not reduce the number of assessment appeals, as is claimed. Companies would still file appeals and argue that their percentages weren't enough for their type of equipment. And if you had arbitrary percentages, for some equipment that doesn't have any application software, they would be getting a reduction. The burden of proof in this issue is clearly on the taxpayer, and as to what is operational software and what is application software that is embedded in the machinery. it's impossible for assessors to independently verify what is embedded and not. Assessors must rely on information and data and documentation that we receive from the taxpayer. They have the information, we don't. So who is best to provide this evidence? Well, certainly the manufacturer of the software that sold it to the taxpayer is the only real reliable source. But manufacturers and suppliers are frequently refused to provide information when it may be detrimental to their customers. The bigger problem, I think, is when the taxpayer is also the manufacturer of that software. So it's often a catch-me-if-you-can type environment. Let me give you a couple of examples, real-life examples in Santa Clara County to this cat-and-mouse situation. An appeal from a major multi-billion-dollar corporation, one of the largest in their industry. For years, the tax manager told us and testified before the Assessment Appeals Board under oath that the records we requested to verify the value of the equipment simply did not exist. That tax manager retires, we get a new tax manager, and they voluntarily provide the records that we asked for, and then told us they always existed. In another major appeal, we had proof that the data provided by the taxpayer's consultant was fabricated. In Santa Clara County, companies that sell leading-edge information and storage and retrieval equipment tell us often that they can't provide the information and the data for their company, and that's the same stuff that they sell to other customers. Let me close by giving one quote from my testimony to the legislative committee that was considering AB 832. In today's world, almost everything is run by a computer chip, from wristwatches to cell phones to iPads to ATM machines to CAT scanners to automobiles, scanners at the checkout counter in supermarkets, and most, if not all, heavy equipment in manufacturing plants. Everywhere you look, machinery and equipment contains embedded chips basic to their function. To not require industry to provide the evidence to support their claims for the exemption would not only be unconstitutional, but it would relegate much of the value of modern equipment to scrap value. The issue is not whether or not there is software embedded in machines. It's whether the taxpayer can prove that what components are not essential to the basic operation and therefore not accessible, and what is.
Thank you, Larry. We're going to have a discussion up here now for members, for both members and also panelists to engage each other in some of the comments that were made. Member Steele has a comment.
You know, it's getting totally different today, and it's very hard to figure it out which is non-taxable application software and it is. But, you know, according to Mr. Parker, let's tax everything. That's not really right, because some of them are non-taxable application software involved with this equipment. So actually I was studying this issue, and I was thinking about same as, you know, agreeing with Mr. Vaniteri that regarding categorize the equipment first. And then if we're going to make it assessors easy, because sometimes that I see some of the assessors just taxing everything on the software on this equipment instead of that through interest parties, then certain percentage of that software, non-taxable application software, like 10% of certain equipments are non-taxable. Then after, I really don't like tables, but we're going to make tables, so make it assessors easy to assess these taxes, unless these business owners that they can provide that what is non-taxable, that they can really prove it. I think that's going to be easy to start. Then, you know, we're going to hear from other industries and how we're going to work these through together, because taxing everything is not right. But at the same time, try to ask assessors to figure it out that, you know, what is taxable and what is not taxable. That's going to be very, very complicated. And I think in the future it's going to be more complicated than ever. Thank you.
Other comments, questions? Comments from the panelists to each other, or clarify?
Yes. And Larry, I appreciate your comments, but I think it's important. Not all taxpayers shade the facts, and obviously there are, you know, one bad apple. What's the that goes with that? So I mean, yes, there are people out there who play games. There's no question about that. But that's not who we're talking about here. And it's very clear. I think it's rule. I don't have my rule book here, but I think it's Board Rule 325 or 315. that in local property tax equalization proceedings, the taxpayer has the burden of proof unless it's a single-family residence, unless it's an escape assessment. I don't need to go through that. So we do have the responsibility to bring forth that information. And I think we all agree with that. The only issue is, what is that information? How much of that information do we have to do? And for the reasons I articulated, it's very difficult to get a software manufacturer who is also doing the hardware and it's bundled to tell us what it is. It does happen on occasion. I had it happen one time in an airline context when we did the master settlement agreement. But that's the only time I've ever had it. So the issue then becomes, if it's a problem for us as the tax-paying side of it, if it's a problem for you on the assessor side, then there has to be a reasonable way based upon data. And I'm not talking about just arbitrary percentages. I know you talked about that, but we're not talking arbitrary. We've got to have data. And we've done this process before, and sometimes it's very I remember we were going through this on the computer tables. Remember how difficult it was to get that information? But we got some, didn't we? So I think that there's a very good chance, because from the standpoint of marketing for the people who make oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers and the whole range of equipment we're talking about, they have an incentive to help out their customers. And I think it's a matter of, well, let's work with them. Let's see what they can do. Let's let the market kind of work on it, and let's work collaboratively. I heard that, I think, in the first panel. And I think if we give it a shot, and if it turns out there's no data, then, that's our burden of proof, that's our problem. But I think the information is out there, and I think it's a matter of getting together and trying to make it work and analyzing that data.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to ask those who want to make a comment from the public, if you could start queuing up here, that would be great. We're going to go to that. I think Larry wants to make a comment.
I'm not suggesting at all that all taxpayers, or even the majority of taxpayers, are trying to fool us or not providing accurate information or trustworthy information. I am suggesting that that's precisely the reason why assessors need proof, verification, and they need, that's why we trust and verify. Because we never know who it is that might be, in the minority, of course, that might be providing inaccurate or fabricated information. I'm completely fine with percentages as long as they are based on accurate data that can be verified in the marketplace. If this is not difficult, then why hasn't it been done? It seems to me that we put the burden of proof on the taxpayer. They tell us in many cases they can't do it. But let me just give you 3 cases real quickly. 3 real cases in Santa Clara County. Case number 1, the Assessment Appeals Board found, and these are all with major corporations, the Assessment Appeals Board found no credible evidence that would prove that there was non-assessable software in that machine. They denied it. The Assessment Appeals Board in case number 2 found credible evidence because the company provided us with that data, and they granted the exemption. Case number 3, the company provided the assessor with credible, detailed cost information sufficient to verify, and we allowed the exemption. So all of those 3 things happened. And all I'm saying is, if you provide us with the data, as in case number 2 or number 3, we will grant the exemption. But we can't do it by just saying 10% on this equipment and 23% on that without the relative data that can be verifiable.
Okay, Mr. Bernal.
Just real quick, again, same as the previous conversation, what's the real question here? And in my opinion, the real question is, does the 1972 law make sense? What we're talking about, coming up with tables and exempting this, that is, in my opinion, bandaging up something that doesn't make sense today. Embedded software is everywhere. Your cell phone doesn't have it in it, it's actually going to be toxic waste. Your cell phone will be toxic waste. My wheelchair, no embedded software, it's junk. It's not worth anything. We have a job to assess property at its market value. That's part. If it's an integral part of the machine, it just makes sense that it is accessible. I think we need to look back at the 1972 law. This is coming from someone who, and many of you know me in my previous life, a pretty conservative, anti-tax person. And when Larry Stone and I agree on something, all right, It's scary, but it means it's probably correct. I think we need to really look at the 1972 law and make some sense of it, because what was applicable in 72 sure is not applicable today. The last case in point, we were all supposed to come in a bus this morning. The lift broke down, and I will guarantee you that it was because of the software that's in that lift that was a problem. So, and I noticed that these steps aren't working again, and it's probably the software that's embedded in the mechanism. But the point is, you can't get away from it. It's in everything. It's in that camera that's taking the pictures. The value of the machinery is, without the software, is nil or salvageable.
Okay.
The other choice you could have, go to the legislature and let's just exempt personal property. How do you like that? I'd go with that too. But either clarify the 72 law, get rid of personal property. Trying to bandage it up, in my opinion, is just making a bad law
Okay. Member Hughes.
Thank you, Senator Renner. Let me just start out with a statement first. I agree with Assessor Stone that we require certainty. I would argue that certainty really resides with both the assessor and the taxpayer. So with that goal in mind, I would agree with Mr. Bordonaro in terms of the 72 statute. That has to be addressed, just straight up. Obviously, it's inapplicable, not necessarily relevant today. I also think that the likelihood of getting a proposal like AB 832 enacted is difficult. But I want to go back to a couple of suggestions that several of the speakers have spoken to, and that is the role of the board in this particular matter. And I would be interested to know from the speakers whether there is a role for the board to look at being the party that gets the data, obtains the data, and begins to put together some percentages that aren't arbitrary. And I know it means looking at lots of different types of equipment, but it at least would engage the parties on both sides. We would look for the most credible data that is out there. And we've done this in other areas with respect to, valuation lifing studies. And what is wrong with that process? That's, I guess, my
Go ahead
question.
and have somebody go ahead and respond.
I personally don't see anything wrong with it. I believe that's absolutely in the purview and responsibility of your board. I view that as something of a big picture policy bandage, but it does have its usefulness.
And it's not to say that takes the place of the statute. I think we still need to tackle the statute head on, but at least for practical, assessment practice purposes or value.
Go ahead, Joe.
The reality is the law is cardinal, and the law says that application software is not subject to tax. The only issue, until it gets overturned, whether it's a good policy decision or not, to do away with 995, the only issue is how do we value that application software? Mm-hmm. You have a very expert property tax department that has been doing this for at least 20 to 25 years now, and this is particularly well suited for that expertise. And I would strongly encourage the board to take the leadership and to do it.
Yeah, and I'm just saying we have to tackle the statute because there's a huge gap between 1972 and Cardinal. So that's.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask us now to go ahead and let the public come on up and make their comment, if you will. Same as before. Name, who you represent, and a brief comment.
Dave Dorr, representing Caltax. Feel I must come talk about this because I did the staff work on the 1972 bill. It was carried by my boss, Joe Gonzalez, and I think there's some misunderstandings here. I do agree that there's a significant problem in terms of the identifications, segregation, and the board has an important role. That's one of the reasons the board exists, for uniformity property tax procedures, so we agree with that. But the 72 bill at the time was trying to deal with the separation out of intangible values. We weren't, in the Constitution doesn't provide for assessing intangibles. We're trying to separate intangible values, and that's the reason, the whole thrust of the 1972 bill. And that, in context, when it came after the problem of assessing movie films, where that you had a film that had a certain value, but most of that was felt to be intangible. The film itself didn't have the value. It was the intangible values. And then we went on to the other kinds of records, such as business records, that were thought to be intangible. The paper, it's on a piece of paper, that's tangible. But the feeling that the work on that, putting it there, represented the intangible values. Same with architects' drawings and things like that. So the issue wasn't trying to benefit some industry or this or that. It was dealing with intangible property. And the other issue, we're talking about constitutional problems. One, it's intangible. Two, personal property does not have the same constitutional protection as real property. The legislature can change it or do away with it. So it's not a constitutional issue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dorr. Come on up. And other speakers? One other one? Come on up, please.
Jason Chow with Ernst & Young. There are methodologies that have been used to quantify software. These have been done for financial reporting purposes, for tax purposes, for accounting purposes. Here there's techniques that have been used to quantify, whether it's an intangible or a software, component. And I think here, when these methods then were developed, it was sort of like what, you were saying before, is that it's not easy. The data is not readily available, but it was done. And, these methodologies have been accepted by, the tax authorities, whether it's income tax or federal tax, or even from the accounting regulatory bodies. So there is a way, that to measure it. It's been done in other venues. So perhaps here, there could be a way to develop a process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I believe you're correct. I think that companies do not just pull the cost of this stuff out of the air. Many have cost accountants that do nothing but monitor and control the costs that go into manufacturing any one of their products, labor costs, material costs, overhead, and all that kind of stuff. The companies that do are the ones that get the exemption for either from the Assessment Appeals Board or from my staff. Those that don't.
Okay, I'm going to bring us to conclusion and thank the panelists at this point. Also want to thank the Assessors Association for participating and I guess responding to our summons. Is that what we did to them? Yeah. And appreciate that greatly. I want to especially thank to our folks that were key to helping us put to this together, David Gow and Dean Kinney, and helping us to lead this process. At this point, I think what we want to do is I'm going to turn this back over to the chair, because I think one of the issues that came up in this discussion is, what is our role? Where do we want to go from there? And I think we want to have a brief discussion in regards to maybe what we have gleaned from this and where we need to respond to and opportunities that we have before us based upon the discussion that we had. So, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Runner, for your leadership in conducting the hearing. It's very informative, very stimulating in thought as well. Obviously, there are some very complex issues, but not really all that complex when you look at the reality that the world has changed. And the world has changed significantly from a scientific perspective, from an academic perspective, and the things that we've done over the last 50 years just won't suffice in the next 50 years as we move forward in trying to address these issues from a governing perspective, from a taxation and evaluating whether it's fairness in taxation, establishing values, defining what is and what's not. So we have some real challenges here, but these are challenges that we can meet. I mean, we have the intellectual capacity to do this, working with the assessors and the Board of Equalization. We have the intellectual capacity to meet these challenges, and I certainly welcome an opportunity to do that. We're going to ask for closing remarks from Member Yee and the rest of our members. Did I catch you off, Mark? Okay.
I'm happy to.
In such cases, we'll go to the assessors. I'm okay catching you off guard.
I can speak.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Member Yee, my apologies.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to offer some thoughts on both issues, and thank you, Senator Runner, for moderating two very stimulating panels. With respect to the first panel on split roll, I really hope we're not back here in 2 years, kind of we're in the same place. And I would like to advance the the examination of the issue in this regard. I really don't think, and today may be the beginning of, I hope, an ongoing public discourse about the issue, but I really don't think it serves any party, any purpose, if it's not an informed public discourse. And I really want to figure out how to get our arms around the conflict that exists among the data and among the studies that have been put forth on split roll. I think the public discourse really ought to be, or the informed public discourse should start with not even an identification of a problem, because that automatically becomes a political discussion, but really, what's the lay of the land? What's happened since 1978? And as we have competing studies that suggest that certain types of property have been treated more advantageously than others, I would like to have some neutral third party, and I really am looking at our own Research and Statistics Division to essentially do kind of a fact check with all of the data that's out there and all the studies that are out there. It's a tall order, and it does become easily politicized, but I really do not want it to be politicized. We as a board, and we in partnership with the county assessors, we have a responsibility in administering this property tax system. And as outside parties have some desire to move with any type of a split roll proposal, I want to be able to speak with at least some level of credibility about what those proposals may mean. And so I think the next step is really trying to resolve some of the conflicts that are out there among the studies and the data in some formalized way. Maybe I'll leave it to that, and I'll speak on the second issue when it's time.
Thank you, Member Yee. Ms. Mandel? Mr. Bogdanario?
All I'm going to say is thank you for the opportunity. And I also want to thank Doug for leaving me these issues to deal with next year. Appreciate that a lot. You're welcome. And for the association for putting me in the position where we need to deal with these issues in this next year. It's going to be challenging, but again, I think if we could all get down and sit down at the table, be realistic, and get what the facts are, whether it is in the embedded software issue or the split roll, and be reasonable, then I think that we can together find solutions to these and other problems. Thank you.
Doug?
I'd like to also echo some of Tom's remarks in that, first of all, I want to thank the board and members of the panels for the discussions we've had today. We have some issues we need to get resolved, and I think the only way we're going to get them resolved is through what we're starting and what we've done today. And hopefully this coming year we'll make some progress. So again, I just want to thank everybody that did participate, as well as our people out in the audience. I think it's important that we address these issues. Move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Runner?
Just a couple of comments on, and to make it on both the topics. The first would be, yeah, I would agree with Member Yee in terms of I think a good rule for us to have would be to step back, have our folks take a look at reviewing, doing some look at the various studies, the issues, the assumptions that have been made in regards to some of the conflicts and issues in regards to split roll. I think that would be good data for us to have. And I think that we've got the ability and capacity to at least blend that and bring that together. I think that's a good issue. I also believe that probably in regards to the embedded software, it could be time for us to take a look at how it is that we can bring together interested parties to determine if there's a path to find solution. I think we've talked about some of the options here. I'm trying to get my arms around the concept of percentages on industries that go from A to Z. But I guess we ought to find out if there's a path there. And certainly I think that's a way to help solve the problem that seems to be right now not solvable, and that may be a path to help get us there. So I think we ought to take a look at maybe looking at bringing this back, maybe as a future discussion for us in regards to how it is that we may want to look at looking at the process of percentages, some aspect of that.
Okay. Member Yee.
Thank you. I agree with Senator Runner. I was going to even take it a step further to see if the Property Tax Committee staff could convene just a discussion session.
We certainly would
Yeah.
be.
Okay.
We could initiate that.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that, rather than have this continue to be fought, through the legislature where we're kind of looking at perhaps the assessors and the industry having to take some very hard positions. I think there's a role for this board to play to bring people together.
The legislative path is fraught with so many challenges.
And I was particularly intrigued by the gentleman that came up from Ernst & Young with respect to, how some of this information and data is available for financial accounting purposes. So to the extent that it's available for that purpose, how does that translate for tax assessment purposes?
Members, let me suggest that it be a joint effort of the Business Tax Committee as well as Property Tax, along the lines of trying to come up with a methodology and a technique as it relates to assessing the embedded software. I don't know if there are standards or if there is a way of coming up with a table that's going to be applicable to everyone, but I certainly believe that there is a methodology, that we can come up with a method, we can come up with a technique which can be employed in every situation, given that the data is there. Even if the default is to say that there is no exemption until the data is provided, that's certainly a reasonable approach as well. And so I think we can entertain that from the board's perspective. So let us take that under consideration. And in closing, let me thank all of you individually and collectively for sharing with us a moment in time. We won't get this moment in time back again, but certainly we'll have an opportunity to revisit the issues. Thank you so very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. The board is hereby adjourned.